time, Nathaniel Essex went from being a mad scientist to a glorified henchman of Apocalypse modified by celestial tech to, well, a dead guy. Is that the end of his story? No, not even close. I mean, we're back for this part 2 after all, right? Mr. Sinister has been manipulating mutants behind the scenes for centuries, and we're only now really digging into that part of his history. Name a mutant and he's likely manipulated them, either physically, mentally, genetically, or some combination thereof. I'm your host, Amanda McKnight, and today I'll be attempting to explain the jaw-dropping retcons and insidious machinations that have made Mr. Sinister the masterful villain and genetic genius he is today. In the Cable annual comic issue from 1999, we skip forward a few years in Mr. Sinister's history to the year of 1899. From this point on, we'll be following the path of Mr. Sinister, the Diamond Clone, and genetically modified mutant. But if you want to learn more about the other clones and what's going on with all of that, be sure to let us know in the comments. I personally would love to cover Sins of Sinister as it unfolds because I'm really excited for this event and I want more reasons to track it closely. Mr. Sinister continued Essex's mission to find a way to break his bond to Apocalypse. To do this, Mr. Sinister awoke Apocalypse once more, and this time he attempted to defeat him by infecting him with the techno-organic virus. You know what they say, if first you make a plague and that doesn't work, it's time to get some techno-organic virus and try that. However, Apocalypse's control and power over his own molecular structure saved him, and Mr. Sinister booked it out of there, having failed again to defeat his master. This is where Mr. Sinister's thoughts shifted. He reasoned that if he himself couldn't find a way to defeat Apocalypse, maybe instead he could create a mutant with the means to do so. And this is where he really started to fall down the rabbit hole of obsession with the Grey and the Summers genes. Mr. Sinister throughout his history has had multiple ties to the X-Men, not just through Cyclops and Jean Grey, but also through Wolverine and other members. With Logan, Sinister's interference with him personally comes into play in 1907, although in the greater scheme of Wolverine's life, Mr. Sinister would also have ties to Weapon X as well via Amanda Mueller, who for now is kinda just like lurking in the shadows and the dark, but who we will come back to later in this video. In 1907, one of Mr. Sinister's experimental polar bears, heard that right, attacked feral Logan's family, which at that time was a pack of wolves that he'd been running with in the great northern wilderness of Canada. Aw. Poor wolves. That's right, we are now venturing into the retcon backstory territory of Origin 2, so watch out, here we come, Origin 2. Logan would end up as a test subject of Sinister himself after spending some time as a wild man circus show attraction. Mr. Sinister was amazed by Logan's healing factor, testing its limits to horrific degrees. Logan escaped Sinister and seemingly killed him at the end of the Origin 2 series. However, apparently not, as a short time later in 1909, which isn't even that much longer from when he seemingly died, Mr. Sinister once more resurfaces. Here we see him join the Ravencroft Institute as one of their practicing physicians in order to accrue more subjects. Typical Mr. Sinister. Typical! Victor Creed, aka Sabretooth, becomes his ally and helps him to successfully recapture Logan, who he's now currently obsessed with. Fortunately, Dr. Claudia Russell, who also works at Ravencroft, puts her life on the line to help Logan, setting him free, so take that, Mr. Sinister. Mr. Sinister shortly after leaves Ravencroft, according to the one-shot Runes of Ravencroft, Sabretooth, issue number 1. Gotta love these retcon issues adding in the history. Not only does Mr. Sinister have ties to important mutant characters, but he also has ties to historical characters and events as well. He was involved with Rasputin in Russia up until the time of his assassination, persuading Rasputin to join him in his work, creating a race of superhumans. Mr. Sinister would also later be involved in World War II as well, using the war to his own advantage when it came to conducting his genetic experiments and gathering various genetic samples. Sinister has also been involved with various mutants and their family trees, beyond even the Summers family, although the Summers family remains one of his favorites to mess with for sure. Following the First World War, he got involved with the Shaw family in England, forcing one member of the family, Jacob Shaw, the father of Sebastian Shaw, to develop shapeshifting abilities. Mr. Sinister also has ties to the High Evolutionary, or Herbert Wyndham, as he was once known, as Sinister was working at Oxford at the same time a young Wyndham was there as well. It's also been implied that Sinister may have even been Wyndham's mysterious benefactor, inspiring and aiding him on his journey to becoming the high evolutionary, but it's only implied. Following the Great Depression, Mr. Sinister took up residence in LA, hosting lavish parties for the stars of the time, and became obsessed with British socialite Faye Livingstone, who he may have been in love with. He conducted experiments on her, and she seemingly developed kinda like Stockholm Syndrome, it seems, staying willingly with him, because she also loved him, until one day he wordlessly set her free. In the future, Genesis would kidnap Faye and attempt to use her to mentally break Sinister, making the X-Men wonder if Mr. Sinister might actually be capable of love. This was when Faye in the future, she was older, so it's a little old lady, and they gotta have one last dance, which I don't know how I feel about that, because that seems like a weird relationship. During World War II, Sinister allied himself with Germany and the Axis, working as a scientist for them. While working at camps, he earned the nickname of Nosferatu, and of course would use prisoners as test subjects, trading candy to prisoners for their blood. Max Eisenhardt, also in the camps, would make note of Mr. Sinister's presence here, Max Eisenhardt being the man who would go on to become known by the name Eric Lenscher, and later as the master of magnetism, Magneto. During this time, Sinister also became fascinated with Namor the Submariner, who he would later clone, although this clone would be defeated by Captain America. Sinister would meet John Greycrow and recruit him as the first member of his new Marauders team, the Marauders team that most people are more familiar with, although not to be confused with the current Marauders team, which is Captain Kate Pryde's Marauders team, different team. Mr. Sinister also utilized the Vietnam War to his advantage, making use of the chaotic time in history to kidnap soldiers and civilians and use them as his test subjects. He loves those test subjects, guys. He was known by the people he preyed on as the White Devil here. Some did take note of people going missing, and Sabretooth was actually hired to track them down. After Sabretooth's employer was killed by Greycrow, Victor was instead bought off and offered a place on Sinister's Marauders, which, yeah, that seems like a logical Sabretooth move to me. At some point, while operating under the alias once more of Dr. Milbury, Sinister became one of the key members of Project Black Womb. This project was headed by Amanda Mueller, Sinister's former creepy ally. Remember her? The Black Womb Project researched and experimented on thousands of young mutants, including some of the members of the project's own offspring. Mortimer Toynbee, who would grow up to become mutant villain Toad, would also be one of their test subjects. Sinister worked on Project Black Womb alongside Amanda Mueller, father of Professor X, Brian Xavier, father of Juggernaut, Kurt Marco, father of Mutant Hazard, Alexander Reiking, father of Sebastian Shaw, Jacob Shaw, and Destiny, aka Irene Adler. So if you wanted to give out some, terrible Parent of the Year awards, those are some people you might want to give them to. Sinister also injected some of these young mutants with his own DNA. This is likely why when Charles Xavier interacted with Sinister again years later at Oxford, where Sinister lectured on genetics, Charles could not use his powers to read Mr. Sinister's mind. Continuing in this line of creepy experimentation, Mr. Sinister became the proprietor of the state home for foundlings, so he could once again study the development of mutants. He created a lab under the orphanage, which existed right up until its destruction in issue number 1 of the Hellion series on the team's first mission. Sinister would often pose as the director of the orphanage, Mr. Pearson, or as a fellow orphan named Nate. This is the orphanage that Alex Summers, aka Havoc, and Scott Summers, aka Cyclops, went to after their parents had seemingly died in a plane crash, though of course their parents had really been abducted by the Shi'ar Empire, as we now know. For more on that, you can check out the original Attempting to Explain this Summers Family Tree video, where we talk about basically all that craziness. Sinister wanted to keep the boys separated, and so Alex ended up adopted while Scott stayed on at the orphanage. Scott was actually almost adopted thanks to the compassionate efforts of Robin Hanover, a staff member at the orphanage. However, Sinister put a stop to that. He killed the couple that would have adopted Scott and lobotomized Hanover. After learning of his almost adopted parents' deaths, Scott ran away from the orphanage and ended up in the care of Professor Charles Xavier, which honestly, that was probably a good move on Scott's part. Although, Charles has his problems too, but at least he's not Mr. Sinister. Who do you guys think is worse, Charles Xavier or Mr. Sinister in terms of, I guess, a father-ish figure? Oh boy. Sinister was determined though, and he would not give up when it came to his Summers obsession. He would creepily become the neighbor of Philip and Deborah Summers, Scott's grandparents. Mr. Sinister also forced Alex's powers to activate and was responsible for bonding his powers to the living monolith, Amit Abdal, which is totally a thing that happened. And as if that didn't fill up enough of his time, Mr. Sinister also monitored a young Jean Grey, and even attempted to kidnap her at one point, but failed. Thank goodness. As Professor X brought his team of X-Men together, Sinister wanted in on that sweet, sweet gathering of mutant DNA. So he hired Kraven to acquire it for him, and would later use said DNA in combination with Kraven's DNA and a piece of the Carnage symbiote to create the clone Zraven, what a great name, who would end up turning on his creator, which really would end up being a common occurrence for Sinister in his life. Not a lot of love for Sinister from his creations. I wonder why. He also created a clone of Jean Grey known as Madeline Pryor, whose life was sparked by a piece of the Phoenix Force after the Phoenix's seeming death on the moon. Mr. Sinister would arrange for her to meet Scott, hoping to create a powerful mutant offspring between the two. Madeline Pryor would be set up as a pilot for a cargo plane company owned by Cyclops' grandparents. The two would meet, fall in love, get married, and eventually would have a child together, one that Sinister hoped to acquire, but ultimately ended up getting away from him and becoming the time-traveling, big gun-carrying mutant Cable, aka Nathan Summers, aka Nathan Dayspring. Coming back around, guys. Gambit at one point came to Mr. Sinister, hoping to get help controlling his powers. Sinister succeeded in helping Gambit, reducing his power levels to give him better control over his abilities. This was great for Gambit, but of course the downside was it meant he was indebted to Mr. Sinister, which is honestly a pretty big negative there. Gambit, you should have thought that through, man. In Powers of X, or I believe it's actually Powers of 10, we learned that after Sinister perfected his cloning technology, he would create Bar Sinister on an island in the South Pacific. Bar Sinister is Sinister's home base and is populated exclusively by clones of Mr. Sinister himself. While on Bar Sinister, he would end up agreeing to a deal with Professor X and Magneto, who wanted him to create a comprehensive catalog of the entire mutant genome. Although, as part of this agreement, his mind would be wiped of having ever made the agreement. Powers of 10 issue number 4 also has one of my all-time favorite lines that Mr. Sinister has ever said in response to Charles and Eric showing up. "Before either of you says another word, I want to make one thing perfectly clear. I love that cape. Amazing! Why do I not have a cape? How do I not have a cape?" And when one of his clones says that he most definitely should have had one the whole time, Sinister asks, "Why didn't you say something?" ordering his subjects to execute this man. It might seem random and unnecessarily cruel when you consider the mutant massacre and Sinister's role in it. He was the one to order the Morlocks dead, but oddly enough the Morlocks were also in a way the result of his own science, which could have also influenced his choice to attempt to wipe them from the face of the earth. You see, the Morlocks were created by Dark Beast, the alternate Beast from the Age of Apocalypse reality, the reality of Earth 295, and Dark Beast was actually the student of Earth 295, or AOA, Sinister. So in a weird way, the Morlocks are also kinda like an alternate version of Sinister's creation. Mr. Sinister ordered the Morlocks killed, as he saw them as an affront to evolution and the mutant gene pool. The massacre orders were followed through by Sinister's Marauders, led by Gambit, who as we previously stated, owed Sinister for his help. Tragically, only a few Morlocks survived. Sad. Sinister also interfered with the lives of Polaris, Lorna Dane, the daughter of Magneto, and Malice, one of his own Marauders. Mr. Sinister ordered Malice to possess Dazzler's body, but when this failed, she possessed Polaris instead. Malice would become the Marauders' new leader as a result, but would also later become permanently stuck in the body of Polaris. It would only be after the seeming death of Sinister that Malice would become weak enough to be separated from Polaris, freeing them both about 30 issues later, which is quite a while in comics. That's like a few years, so yeah. After Jean Grey returned, Sinister attempted to destroy his creation Madeline Pryor before people learned the truth of her origin. This was basically what prompted Maddie to turn evil and lose her mind. The Marauders were sent to take her out and retrieve her son. While the Marauders shot Maddie multiple times in the attack, she actually would survive this. Furious at the Marauders' failure, as we saw in Sinister's first visual appearance in the comics, Sinister deployed them again to finish the job. However, the X-Men saved Maddie this time. Feeling all alone, Maddie made a deal with Nastor in an attempt to get her son back, while Scott, as Cyclops, attempted to get their son back through his own heroic means. While infiltrating Sinister's lab to retrieve baby Christopher Nathan Charles Summers, Madeline Pryor was captured, and Mr. Sinister revealed the truth of her origin to her. Turned out to be probably a pretty bad move on his part, although he didn't know probably this was going to happen. This caused her to suffer a mental break, but also unleashed vast power from within her. Pryor would take the name of Goblin Queen, escaping Sinister and heading to New York City to unleash hell on Earth and Inferno, being opposed and eventually stopped by the joint forces of the X-Men and X-Factor. After Maddie was defeated, it was discovered that someone was psychically attacking Jean Grey. Oh no. This of course was Mr. Sinister. They tracked Sinister to Xavier's school for gifted youngsters where he was attacking. During the confrontation, Essex's involvement in Scott's life from early on was revealed, causing Cyclops to unleash the full force of an optic blast. Psh, all the optic blasts coming out of his eyes. This seemingly killed Sinister, but this is Mr. Sinister we're talking about. So while seemingly dead, this actually wouldn't be the end of his story. But this is the end of this super long video as we are out of time. Thank you so much for watching, and if you would like to hear the rest of Mr. Sinister's convoluted but fascinating life story, be sure to let us know in the comments, and until next time, you stay nerdy, YouTube. Bye!